15 of the letters between Marie Antoinette and Axel von Fersen, her Swedish officer, came down to us written in a cipher only two people could read, and with their tenderest lines blacked out in ink on top of it. Someone sat with a pen and drowned them, stroke over stroke, until the paper gave nothing back. For 2 centuries, nobody could say what was under there or who had put it there. Then, in 2021, a machine read straight through the ink. The writing and the blacking were made of different metals, and X-rays are indifferent to secrets. So, what did the ink hide? And whose hand held that pen? A stranger's or the hand of someone who loved her? Hold both. They do not come back at the same time. She was 19 the winter she met him, and so was he. The Opera Ball in the January of 1774 was the one night the court permitted itself to pretend it had no rules. Anyone with the price of a ticket and a black silk domino could come, and did. Farmers general, actresses, an abbé or two with the collar tucked out of sight, and mixed in among them under the same cheap masks, half the household of the Dauphin of France. The heat came off the candles in waves. It smelled of wax and orange water and too many people, and under the music the room made a sound like water going over stones, hundreds of voices at once, none of them saying anything they would sign their names to. She had come with her brother-in-law, the Comte de Provence, and lost him inside 10 minutes, which was the entire point of the exercise. Behind the mask, she was nobody. That was the drug. Marie Antoinette had been in France for 4 years, and in 4 years, she had learned that a Dauphin may not sit where she likes, may not eat when she is hungry, may not close a door. But a woman in a domino, with her hair powdered like every other woman's and her mouth the only thing showing, could walk up to a stranger and say whatever came into her head, and the stranger had to answer her as an equal, because he did not know any better. She picked the tall one by the pillar because he was standing very straight and looked entirely lost. "You are not French," she said. "No," he said. "You say no like a man being asked to confess to something." He was Axel von Fersen, a Count of Sweden, a young soldier passing through Paris on the long, ornamental tour that fathers of good family inflict on their sons. He was 19 years old. He had a letter of introduction in his pocket, and no idea what to do with it, and he had been standing at that pillar for the better part of an hour, doing the arithmetic of a young man with a good name and a thin purse in the most expensive city in Europe. He answered her in French with an accent she could hear at once, and she liked it, and she let him see that she liked it, which was already more than she was permitted. They talked. He did not know who she was, so he talked to her the way a man talks to a woman he might never see again. Plainly, a little clumsily, with the awful honesty of the very young. She asked what he thought of the French. He said something careful. She told him to try again. He tried again, less carefully, and she laughed behind the mask. And the laugh was the mistake, because a laugh carries. And half the room had spent 4 years learning that particular laugh. The crowd began to move, not violently. It was worse than violent. It was polite. It thickened. It turned. People who had been talking about horses stopped talking about horses, and the small human tide that surrounds royalty everywhere and always came in around her. And the courtiers of her household stepped up on either side, and someone said, "Madam," out loud, and the word went through the crush like a crack across a pane of glass. Fersen was still standing there with his answer half finished. He understood in stages, the way one does. First that she was known, then that she was known to everyone. Then, and this is the part he would remember, and write down, and think about for the rest of a long and disciplined life. That she had known he did not know, and had let him go on for a quarter of an hour anyway, because for a quarter of an hour she had been permitted to be a girl at a ball. She was carried off by the crowd. She did not look back. She had already learned not to. He wrote it down that night, or near enough. A foreign officer of no fortune in France, 19, standing in the cooling wax smell of the opera, with the whole of the Dauphin's household between him and the door. In 4 months, a king would die of the smallpox at Versailles, and the girl in the black domino would be Queen of France. Fersen went back to his lodgings and, in due course, went on to Sweden, because that is what young men on tours do. He did not put the evening away. 4 years is a long time at 19 and no time at all at Versailles, where the same people said the same things at the same hours in the same rooms, and the only news was who had been asked to Marley. Fersen came back to France in the autumn of 1778, older, still poor in the only country that mattered, still Swedish. He had a colonel's ambitions and a Swedish king's goodwill, and not one arpent of French land. That was the whole of his estate, favor. Favor and a straight back. He was presented, as everyone was presented, in the shuffling human queue of the court, and he expected nothing, because a man who expects something at Versailles is a man who has not been there. She saw him from across the room. The Queen of France was 23 by then, and she was standing where she always stood, in the center of a circle of people who were all watching her and all pretending to watch each other. She looked up. She looked at him for perhaps 2 seconds, which, at Versailles, is a public act. And then she said it lightly, pleasantly, at exactly the pitch that carries to the back wall. Ah, an old acquaintance. 4 words. Everyone heard them, which was the point. A thing said in front of 40 people cannot be a secret, and a queen who wishes to speak to a man will speak to him in front of 40 people or not at all. The circle registered it. That is what circles do. Somewhere near the windows, the Comte de Mercy Argenteau, ambassador of the Empress of Austria and the most patient man in France, filed the moment away without moving his face. He had been sent to Versailles to look after the interests of Vienna, and the interests of Vienna were, in practice, one girl. He wrote to her mother. He wrote often. He wrote about what she wore, whom she spoke to, how long she spoke to them, and how many times he had gambled at faro, and for how much. And the letters went east in the diplomatic bag, past every French official who might have wished to read them, and did. Nobody had to tell the Queen she was being watched. She had known since she was 14. Understand the shape of the thing, because it is not the shape people expect. The gap between them was not that he was common. He was a count, of a house older than half the dukes in that room. It was not that she was married. Half the marriages in that room were arrangements with a chapel attached. The gap was drier and more absolute than that. He was foreign. He held no French office, no French rent, no French land. He could not be given anything of substance without a dozen French families asking loudly why a Swede was being fed from the king's hand, and the pamphleteers of the Palais Royal, who could turn a nothing into a printed nothing overnight for a few sous, would ask it in verse. And she was the most watched woman in Europe. Not admired, watched. She could not put on a shift in the morning without a ranked procession of women passing it hand to hand by right of birth, the highest rank present taking the honor, so that a Queen of France sometimes stood naked to the waist in a cold room while duchesses arrived. Her table was public. Her dinner was public. Strangers with a sword and a hat could stand in the room and observe her chew. Against that, an old acquaintance is a very large sentence. He came to her card table that winter and to others, and he was very correct, and everyone approved of how correct he was, and that itself was the trap. Correctness is a thing the court can measure, and what the court can measure, the court will report. Madame Campan, first woman of the bedchamber, missed nothing and said less. The Comte de Provence, the king's brother, who had a fine mind and no throne and a great deal of time, noticed which men the queen laughed at and kept his own arithmetic. Fersen's answer to all of it was to leave. In 1780, he sailed for America with the French army, and the court told itself the story it liked best, that the Swede had gone to war to remove himself from a difficulty. He wrote to his sister Sophie Piper, who had his confidence entirely, and told her what he could tell her, which was less than she wanted and more than he told anyone else. Distance is not a solution. It is only an address. So there were letters because there was nothing else there could be. And letters at Versailles were a public utility. The postal cabinet of the king opened them, copied the interesting ones, sealed them again with counterfeit seals, and sent them on their way. And everyone knew it, and everyone wrote accordingly. A letter left in a room was a letter read. A letter given to a footman was a letter read twice, which is where Geneviève Aumont comes in. And she comes in the way the useful people always do, carrying something and saying nothing. She was 46, femme de chambre, a widow with hands ruined by needlework and a face made for not being remembered. She had a sewing box of plain fruitwood, scarred at one corner, the sort of object no inventory ever bothered to list, and in the sewing box there was a pincushion of green silk stuffed hard with wool. And under the wool, there was a floor that came out if you knew to press the seam. It held perhaps 3 folded sheets. It had held them before. Geneviève, the queen said, one evening in the cabinet interieur, with the door shut and the candles making that small, tearing sound they make when the wax has gone wet. How long does a letter take to breast? That would depend on the letter, madame. The queen looked at her for a moment and then went on writing. What she was writing would have baffled anyone who lifted it. She used a cipher, and she was not casual about it. She worked from a grid, letters against letters, and she copied slowly and got it wrong sometimes and crossed it out and did it again, and the page filled up with rows of nonsense that only 2 people in Europe could open. It took her 3 times as long as an ordinary letter would have taken. She did it anyway. There's a particular kind of love that shows itself as clerical labor at midnight. She sealed it herself. She would not have a footman touch the wax. She held the stick to the flame and let the red gather and fall, and pressed it, and the room smelled for a moment of hot resin and burnt string, and then she sat with her hand flat on the page, not moving. Madame, said Geneviève Aumont, the box is on the chair. The queen did not answer straight away. She was thinking, one supposes, about what she was handing over. A sheet of paper that could be lifted from a courier by any clerk with a warm knife and a little patience, in a country where warm knives were an institution. She had signed nothing. She had ciphered everything. And still, a page in her hand is a page in her hand, and the king's brother could read, and the ambassador of Austria could read, and the men who wrote the pamphlets could not read, but did not need to. You will not put it in your pocket, she said. No, madame. You will not give it to anyone in the Ode de Boeuf, not even to someone who says I sent them. No, madam. The letter went into the pincushion, under the wool, under the floor that came out. The green silk closed over it. Geneviève Aumont picked up her plain fruitwood box, scarred at one corner, and carried it out through rooms full of people who had spent their whole lives learning to see everything, and not one of them saw a thing, because there was nothing there to see but a servant with her mending. 230 years later, that page, or one very much like it from the same hand, in the same ink and the same careful cipher, would be lying under a machine in Paris while men in gloves waited to find out what someone had taken such trouble to bury. But that comes later. The wax was still soft. The Chesapeake in October smelled of mud and horses and wet rope, and there was not a candle within 3,000 miles that anyone had bothered to send. Fersen had crossed an ocean to get here. He had done it in a ship that took 70 days, in a berth the size of a coffin, eating salt meat with men who had names older than his and less money. And he had done it for the one commodity a poor foreign count could still acquire without a French estate or a French wife, a reputation earned where everyone could see it. He was aide-de-camp to the Comte de Rochambeau, which meant he wrote in 3 languages and rode wherever the old man pointed and slept when there was nothing to point at. At Yorktown, in the October of 1781, he stood in the lines and watched a British army walk out and lay down its arms. It took hours. That is the part nobody tells you. Surrender is not a moment. It is an afternoon of men in red coats walking slowly between 2 lines of men who have been ordered not to gloat, and the drums going, and the ground churned to soup by the rain, and the officers' faces doing the arithmetic of what they will say when they get home. Fersen sat his horse and watched it and said nothing, because he was an aide, and aides do not have opinions in public. He wrote about it later, and what he wrote about was the discipline. Of course it was. He was good at this. That is worth saying plainly because the story that came down to us made him a lover first and a soldier by accident. And the reverse is nearer the truth. He was competent, cold under fire, useful in 4 languages, and the French officers who had arrived, prepared to despise a Swede, went home speaking well of him. Rochambeau wrote of him kindly. A man builds what he can with what he is given, and Fersen had been given a body, a name, and no money at all. An ocean is a long way to go to stop thinking about someone. The offers came, as offers do, because a young man with a good war behind him is suddenly worth a great deal to families with daughters and no glory. There was a Swedish match, and there was talk of an English heiress with a fortune that would have bought him a province. And his father wrote to him about it in the tone fathers use: reasonable, patient, and entirely immovable. His sister, Sophie Piper, wrote too, and Sophie had the advantage of knowing what she was asking. He answered her from camp, with the paper damp and the ink going thick in the cold. I cannot belong to the one person to whom I would wish to belong, he wrote. The only one who truly loves me, and so I will belong to no one. Read that twice and notice what it is not. It is not a vow. It is not a young man being romantic at a desk. It is a piece of household accounting, done in the flat voice of a man who has already added the column twice and knows the answer will not change. And the sum in that column was every marriage he would not make, every child he would not have, every house that would not be his. He was 26. He kept the resolution for 30 years. He never married. Not once, not later, not when it would have been convenient, not when it would have been kind. Sophie kept the letter, which is why we have it. His secretary in those years and for years after was a Swede named Otto Sandström, 34, a copyist of the sort every gentleman of business kept, a man whose entire professional existence was the reproduction of other men's sentences in a legible hand. He had a tremor in his right hand, faint, worse in the cold, and it dragged on certain strokes, so that his lowercase f came out with a small stutter in the descender, always the same, like a signature he had not agreed to. He made fair copies, that was the arrangement. Fersen wrote, Sandström copied, and the copy stayed in the box. The register, monsieur, Sandström would say, in the evening, with the candle at his left because of the hand. The register. Fersen kept copies of his secret letters, copies of what he sent, notes of what he received, dates, initials, a running account in a leather-bound book, all of it in the hand of a Swedish clerk who could not read the cipher he was transcribing and did not ask. A man who does that is not being careless. He is being exactly the opposite. He is a soldier who wants the record to exist, who cannot bear for a thing to have happened and left no trace, and who has therefore built, with his own patience, in his own house, the single most dangerous object either of them would ever touch. Sandström blew out the candle and went to bed. The book stayed on the shelf. 4,000 miles east, the woman he was not writing to that night was being taken apart in print. The Petit Trianon was not a palace. It was a small house with a small garden, and the whole of its scandal was that at the Petit Trianon, a queen of France could sit down without 8 women arranging themselves by rank behind her chair. She wore muslin there. She had a rule, a real one, written down, that when she entered a room, nobody was to rise. That was the crime. Not the diamonds, not the gambling, not the Swede. The crime was a woman with a door she could close. Versailles had no privacy and therefore did not believe in it. If a door was shut, something was happening behind it. And if you did not know what, you invented it. And if you were clever, you sold the invention for a few sous in the arcades of the Palais Royal. The pamphlets, the libelles, were the great growth industry of the age. Cheap paper, filthy verse, a woodcut of a woman with her legs apart and a crown askew, printed in Amsterdam or in a cellar off the Rue Saint-Honoré and hawked openly under the arcades where the police had no writ to go in. The king's men bought them up by the crate to suppress them, which taught the printers that libel against the queen was the most reliable income in France. They wrote her as a glutton. They wrote her as an Austrian spy. They wrote her with her husband's brothers, with her women, with a cardinal, with the gardener at Trianon, and there was no charge so absurd that a printer would not set it in type by Thursday. She read them. That is the detail people skip. They were brought to her, or she found them, and she read them, and she knew what her own subjects believed she did with her nights. And then, in the summer of 1785, a woman named Jeanne de la Motte discovered that you could simply use the queen's name like a key. The necklace was a monstrosity. 647 diamonds or thereabouts. A jeweler's ruinous gamble made for a king's mistress, who had died before he could buy it. The queen had refused it twice. She said in public that France needed ships more than she needed diamonds, and she meant it, and it made no difference whatsoever. Jeanne de la Motte found a cardinal. The Cardinal de Rohan wanted one thing in the world, which was to be spoken to by the Queen, who had not spoken to him in years and had excellent reasons. So they forged letters. They signed them Marie Antoinette de France, which is not how a Queen of France signs anything, and a prince of the church read that signature and believed it, because a man who wants a thing badly enough will accept the worst forgery in Europe. And then they put a woman in a grove. That is the part that ought to be impossible. On a summer night in the garden of Versailles, in the dark under the trees, a prostitute, hired for the resemblance, stood in a white dress and handed the Cardinal de Rohan a rose and said a few words. And he went away, certain he had been forgiven by the Queen of France. He then bought the necklace on credit in her name. It went to Jean de la Motte. It went to London in pieces, stone by stone, and it was never seen whole again. The Queen had no idea any of it had happened until the jeweler came to be paid. She was tried by proxy and vindicated, in fact. The Parlement of Paris heard the case in 1786 and acquitted the cardinal, which was itself a verdict against her, since a man can only be acquitted of insulting a queen if the queen was insultable. And no court, no magistrate, no examining judge ever found one thread connecting her to the swindle, because there was none. She was innocent, legally, factually, entirely. Paris carried the cardinal home on its shoulders through crowds cheering in the streets. Here's the mechanism, and it has not changed in 240 years. The crowd had already reached its verdict, and the court's verdict arrived too late to matter, and so the acquittal simply became further proof that she had arranged it. The judges found nothing. The Labelles explained that this was because she was clever. There is no answer to that. There has never been an answer to that. A pamphlet lay on her dressing table one morning at Versailles, brought in with the rest, and she turned it over with 2 fingers, the way one turns something dead. The Comte de Provence read them all. He had a fine library and a finer memory, and he was the king's brother and would never be king while his brother lived. And he made it his business to know precisely how much his sister-in-law was hated and by whom. Mercy Argenteau wrote to Vienna about the necklace at enormous length, in the tone of a man who had warned everyone. Madame Campan said nothing, because Madame Campan had made a career of it. The room was cold. The fire had been laid but not lit, because the woman whose office it was to light it had precedence over the woman who had brought the coal, and the woman with precedence had not come. The Queen picked up the pamphlet, held the corner to a candle, and watched it take. It burned badly. Cheap paper burns fast and dirty, and the ash lifted and went sideways and settled on the marble, gray on white. There was a sound from the courtyard, a bucket, somebody swearing at a horse. She put the last corner down on the hearth and let it go out on its own. Then she washed her hands, dried them, sat down, and reached for the grid. Because there was one thing in her day that nobody had managed to print. In the fruitwood box with the scarred corner, under the green silk pincushion, under the floor that came out if you pressed the seam, there were 3 folded sheets in a cipher of her own working, addressed to a Swedish officer, and not one printer in the Palais Royal had ever laid a finger on a single line of them. They had invented everything about her. They had not yet found the true thing. In the October of 1789, the women of Paris walked to Versailles in the rain. 6,000 of them, or something near it. Market women, fishwives, women with pikes, and women with children, and behind them the National Guard, who had not been asked and came anyway. They walked 12 miles in the wet. They wanted bread, and they got a king. By the next afternoon, the royal family was in a carriage on the road to Paris, moving at a walking pace, surrounded by a crowd carrying loaves on bayonets and shouting that they had the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. The Tuileries had not been lived in for 100 years. Nobody had thought to warn them. There was no furniture worth the name. There was dust, and there were rooms full of the shabby households of minor court people who had squatted there for decades and now had to be turned out. And there was the smell of a building that has been shut. The little Dauphin looked around the place and said, it was ugly here, and his mother told him that a king of France had lived here once, and that made it good enough. The doors did not lock the way doors ought to lock. Guardsmen stood in the corridors. Anyone with a cockade could come and look at them. They were not prisoners. That was the official position, and it was maintained with great care by everyone, and the guards were doubled every month. And Fersen was in Paris. He took rooms, and he moved chiefly through a household on the Rue de Clichy, belonging to a Scot named Quintin Crawford, a collector, a man of money, rich from India, and to Eleanor Sullivan, who lived under Crawford's roof and was, by every account, close to Fersen, and knew about the other thing and said nothing about it, which made her one of the most disciplined people in France. The house had money, horses, and a reason to receive foreigners. It was, for a while, the most useful address in Paris. The letters changed. They had been an ache carried across an ocean. Now they were in operation, and an operation has staff. Baptiste Ferrand was 37, and he ran the road at night. He had done it for wine merchants before he did it for anything else, and the skill was identical. Leave late, keep off the paved crown of the road because paving talks, and know the ditch by its smell before you know it by sight. He carried no lantern past the barriere. He said a lantern was a man announcing where his throat was. "How far tonight?" Fersen asked him once, in the yard with the horse breathing steam. "Villemontier by 3, said Ferrand. "It changes there. After that, it isn't mine." At Villemontier, the horses came out and other horses went in, and a packet passed from a hand to a hand in a stable yard at 3 in the morning, and neither hand asked the other's name, and that is how a letter from a queen crossed a country that had begun to read every letter it could catch. Marcel Fontaine was 29, and he was a guard at the Tuileries, and he was not a villain. He had been a clerk before the guard, which meant he could read a hand and knew what a seal ought to look like, and what it looked like when it had been lifted with a warm knife and put back. He believed in the nation. He believed a king could be a citizen. And he believed, with total sincerity, and here's the difficulty, that a queen of France writing in cipher to a foreign officer whose sovereign was arming against the revolution was a woman committing treason against the people of France. He was, on the facts available to him, not wrong. He stood in a corridor at the Tuileries and watched a woman with a sewing box go through. And he let her go, and he made a note of the day. Through that winter and into the next, the low voices went on in the house on the Rue de Clichy, and a word began to come up in them that was not the word for a letter, a road, a relay. Fresh horses at intervals northeast, toward the frontier, toward men in Austrian coats. And a carriage, a large one, being talked about, being ordered, being paid for by a man with no French fortune who had somehow found the money. They were going to put the King of France in a berline and drive him out of his own country. The boy would not put his shoe on. He was 6 years old, and he had been woken at 10:30 at night and dressed as a girl, and the dress was somebody else's, and the shoe pinched, and he sat on the edge of the bed in the dark with his mouth going square. Madame de Tourzel knelt in front of him. Nobody lit a candle. In a corridor 2 rooms away, a guardsman coughed, and everyone in the room stopped breathing until he had finished, and the child, who understood nothing except that the grown people had gone strange, put his foot in the shoe. "We are going to a place in the country," his mother said, "and you are to be called Amélie." He thought that was funny. That was the one piece of luck they had that night, and they spent it early. The night of the 20th into the 21st of June, 1791, was warm and moonless in Paris, and the Tuileries was a building with too many doors and not enough of them watched. That was the whole design. There was a door out of an unoccupied apartment on the ground floor, in a wing that had no sentry because nobody lived in it, and the family went out through it one at a time, at intervals, over the better part of 2 hours. A woman in gray with a wide hat, a man in a plain coat and a round wig who had been king of France since he was 19, 2 children, a governess. Each of them walked out past soldiers who had been guarding them for 20 months and did not turn ahead, because a servant leaving at night is not an event. The king came out last but one. He had trouble with the door. There was a hackney cab standing in the Place du Petit Carrousel with its lamps out, and the driver on the box was in a drab coat with the collar up and a hat pulled down and had been sitting there for an hour and a half doing what cab drivers do, which is nothing, visibly, forever. He had spent a week learning the streets. He had bought the horses. He had paid for the great new berline waiting outside the barriere, a traveling carriage built to hold 6 and a mountain of luggage, the finest coach money could make, and the worst possible object, in which to be inconspicuous. And the money had come from a Swede with no French estate who had gone to Crawford and to Eleanor Sullivan and to anyone who would lend and had signed for it himself. Axel von Fersen drove the King of France out of his own capital. He did it badly at first. He took a wrong turn on purpose or by nerves. The story goes both ways and neither version helps, and lost perhaps half an hour circling in the dark with the Queen of France sitting behind him in a hired cab in a gray dress, waiting. She had got lost herself on foot in the streets she had lived beside for 20 months, because a woman who has been carried everywhere since she was 14 does not know how a city joins up. She had walked alone in the dark, past a carriage full of shouting men with torches, and had got in beside her husband at last and said something light, because she had been trained since childhood to say something light. The horse's hooves on the stone, that was the sound of the whole enterprise. A cab going at a walk through Paris at midnight, with the man on the box holding the reins in gloved hands and not once turning around to look at the woman behind him. They cleared the barriere at 2 in the morning, or near it, and found the berline waiting in the dark with the fresh horses. And the family transferred, and Fersen took the box again and drove them on to Bondy at a proper pace at last, out into the country air, hay and dust, and the wheels going over, everything running, everything working. At Bondy, the king told him to get down. It was already agreed. That is the part that makes it worse. It had been discussed and settled in the house on the Rue de Clichy, in the low voices of men making a plan, and the logic was unanswerable. A foreign officer on the box of the king's carriage was a gift to every pamphleteer in France, and if they were taken with a Swede driving, the whole flight became what their enemies already called it, an escape to the Austrians arranged by the queen's foreigner. So Fersen was to leave them at the edge of Paris and go to the frontier by his own road, alone, and meet them there. He asked anyway. On the road, in the dark, with the horses steaming, he asked to drive them the rest of the way. No, said the king, go. Nobody wrote down what his face did, and he did not write it down either, which tells you something. He stepped off the box into the road. He said, "Adieu, Madame de Korff," because that was the name on the passport of the Russian baroness whose traveling party they all were pretending to be. And it was the only thing he was permitted to say out loud, and he said it to the whole carriage. Then the berline went north without him, and he stood in the dark and listened to it stop being audible. He rode for Belgium that night, hard, and he made the frontier, and for a day and a half he was the only person in Europe who thought the thing had worked. It came apart on small things, the way these things do. They were an hour late leaving, and then 2, and then 3, and a relay of hussars posted up the road waited, and drew the attention of every village they were sitting in, and finally were withdrawn or drank themselves useless. The berline was enormous and slow. The family got out to walk up a hill. They ate. At St. Menehoud, the postmaster, a man named Drouet, looked at the large man in the round wig sitting in the window of the coach and then, by some accounts, at an assignat in his own pocket with the king's face engraved on it, and did the sum. He rode across country by the short way, while they went round by the road. At Varennes there was no post house where they expected one, and there was a gate, and an archway under a tower, and a bridge beyond it that they never reached. They were taken into a grocer's house and sat in an upstairs room with a candle, while the tocsin rang and the National Guard of 4 villages came in over the fields. The king was asked whether he was the king. He said he was. Somewhere in that hour it stopped being an escape and became a procession. They came back to Paris over 3 days at a walking pace in the June heat, 60 miles, with an escort that grew until it was thousands, and the dust, and the crowds standing along the road. And this is the detail that survived. The crowds were told to keep their hats on and say nothing, so they did. A king of France was brought home through his own country in total silence, in a carriage packed with people, at the speed of a man walking, and hats stayed on heads for 60 miles. Fersen heard it in Brussels. The letters he wrote in the days after are a soldier's letters. Dates, names, what went wrong, the hussars, the hours lost. And then, in the middle of the arithmetic, one line asking whether she was alive. Everything they had built to that night, the couriers, the cipher grid, the packets that changed hands at 3 in the morning in a stable yard where nobody used names, had been an apparatus for getting words across a country. It had worked for years. It had just failed for a carriage. After Varenne, there was no more pretending. The word liberty had been doing a great deal of work at the Tuileries, and it stopped. Guards were doubled and then doubled again. The doors of the Queen's apartments were to stand open. Men sat in the antechamber at night with muskets, and a woman who had been raised in a court where a duchess handed her a shift by right of birth, now dressed under the eyes of a locksmith's son from Picardy who had orders not to look away. Every scrap of paper in those rooms could kill somebody. That was the arithmetic now, and everyone in the household had learned to do it. Marcel Fontaine had been doing it longer than most. He was 29, he had been a clerk before he was a guard, and a clerk learns two things: hands and seals. He knew what wax looked like when it had been lifted with a warm knife and pressed back down. The ridge of it, the way the impression sits proud of the run. And he had been standing in corridors for the better part of 2 years, watching the traffic of a household that was supposed to have nothing left to say. He stopped a man at the gate in the autumn. A courier, perfectly in order, papers correct, carrying a packet for a merchant house in Brussels. Fontaine turned the packet over twice. The seal was plain. The direction was in a clerk's hand, an ordinary commercial hand, careful, a little slow, and there was a small stutter in the descender of the lowercase f. The same stutter in each one, the way a hand shakes when it is cold or when it always shakes. He had seen that F before. He was almost sure he had seen that F before. "Who wrote this direction?" he said. "A clerk, citizen." "Which clerk?" The man did not know. That was true, and Fontaine could hear that it was true, and he let him go, because a guard who opens a Brussels merchant's mail on the strength of a wobbly letter F is a guard explaining himself to a committee. He wrote the date in his book instead. He wrote the shape of the F. Understand him for a moment, because he is easy to hate and he does not deserve it. The King of Sweden was arming. The Emperor in Vienna was the Queen's own brother. And there was, in fact, a Swedish colonel in Brussels who had driven the king out of Paris with his own hands, and who was, in fact, at that moment, negotiating with foreign courts for an army to come into France. And there was, in fact, a queen in the Tuileries writing to him in a cipher no French officer could open. Fontaine believed a woman in the heart of the state was corresponding in secret with the enemies of the nation. He had no evidence. He was entirely correct. The search came in November or thereabouts. They did it properly. 6 men and an officer, and a clerk with a list, going through the Queen's apartments room by room, while she stood by the window with her hands folded, and answered every question in the voice she used for ambassadors. They took up the carpets, they opened the writing desk, and read what was in it, which was nothing. Because nothing had been in a writing desk in that household since 1789. They looked behind the pier glass. They went through her books one at a time, holding each by the boards and shaking it. Geneviève Aumont sat on a stool by the door with her mending, because a search is no reason for the hems not to be done. Her sewing box stood open on the floor beside her foot the entire time. Plain fruitwood, scarred at the corner, thread and scissors and a paper of pins and a green silk pincushion stuffed hard with wool. An officer of the National Guard stepped over it twice. One of the men picked up the scissors, looked at them, put them down. Nobody touched the pincushion, because a pincushion is not a thing. It is the absence of a thing. It is what a room contains when there is nothing in it. And under the wool, under the floor that came out if you pressed the seam, there was a single folded sheet in the Queen's own cipher that would have hanged a woman of 46 and several others besides. "Is there anything else, madam?" the officer said at last. "You have not looked in the chimney," said the Queen. He looked in the chimney. There was soot. They went away with a list of nothing, and Geneviève Aumont bit off her thread and went on with the hem, and her hands were perfectly steady, which was a skill she had acquired somewhere and never discussed. So it came down to the letters, because everything else was gone. She could not see him. She could not name him. She could not send him anything that was not a risk to somebody with a family. And she went on writing, at night, with the door standing open and a guardsman in the antechamber, working the grid slowly and getting it wrong and doing it again letter against letter, the way she had done it for years. 3 hours clerical labor for a page that a man in Brussels would take 3 hours to open at the other end. The pen, the grid, the candle low. Her hand went across, stopped, went back, crossed a letter out, began again. Somewhere below in the courtyard, a horse was being unharnessed. Buckles. A man saying something to the horse and not to anyone else. The wax had gone soft in the dish and had to be worked with the point of the knife. She put her thumb on the seal to hold it, and the wax came up warm through the paper against her thumb, and she sat with her hand on it until it cooled. The letters from those months are not letters between careful people anymore. They are letters written by two adults who have understood the shape of the thing. There is business in them, money, courts, what Vienna might do, what Brussels would not, and there's a running argument about whether she should let herself be got out alone. And she would not. And he knew she would not. And he asked anyway, over and over, for 2 years. And in among the business in her hand, in the cipher, are the lines that came down to us drowned in black ink. 15 of them, scored out under stroke after stroke of a different ink, so heavily that the paper stayed dark for 230 years. And when the machine in Paris read the metals apart in 2021 and dragged the buried lines back up out of the dark, one letter at a time, what came up was this: that she loved him madly, that she loved him to distraction, and that he could never doubt for a moment that she was entirely his. That is all. That is the whole of the great secret. Not a plot, not a state paper, not an army promised or a fortress named. A woman in a room with a soldier outside the open door, writing in a code that took 3 hours, to a man 400 miles away, to tell him a thing she had never once been permitted to say out loud, in 36 years of being looked at by everybody in Europe. She wrote it in cipher, which means she wrote it knowing it might be caught, and wrote it anyway. He kept it. Of course he kept it. The man who could not bear for a thing to have happened and leave no trace, who had his Swedish clerk copy his own secret correspondence into a leather-bound register at a table with the candle set to the left of a shaking right hand. He kept all of it. He kept the register and the originals, and he took them home to Sweden, and they went into a house, and the house had heirs. And somewhere between that room and the machine, somebody sat down with a pen and put out those lines. Carefully, stroke over stroke. Not the state business, which was left alone and legible. Only the tenderness. Only the words that told you what she was. A hand that hated her would have burned the whole packet. This one kept every page and drowned only the love, and that pointed at a nearer hand than anyone had thought to look for. There is a house north of Stockholm with a long, pale front and a lime avenue running down to the water, and in winter the water goes hard, and the light lasts about 6 hours and then stops. Steninge. It was a Fersen house, and by the 1790s, a French estate was no longer a thing anyone was pretending to want. And it is very handsome and very cold, and about 1,000 miles from the Tuileries. Snow comes off that roof in slabs. A man could stand at a window there in February with his hands behind his back and be as far from the smell of hot wax and orange water as it is possible to get on the same continent. He got there in the end. It took him a while. The monarchy of France went first in the August of 1792, and the king followed it in the January after, tried by the convention, condemned by a margin of a handful of votes, and dead on a scaffold in a square that had been named for his grandfather. He was 38. He had been on the throne since he was 19, since the spring after a girl in a black domino teased a Swedish officer at a ball because he was standing very straight and looked lost. Marie Antoinette was killed on the 16th of October, 1793. She was 37. She wrote a letter at 4 in the morning that day to her husband's sister, and it was never delivered. And she was carted through Paris in an open cart with her hands tied behind her. And that is the whole of what needs saying here, because the world has looked at those 2 hours for 230 years and has still not looked at the 20 years before them. Fersen was in Brussels. The news took days. He had spent the last 2 years doing arithmetic on the impossible. Money, courts, what Vienna might do, what Vienna would not do, which was always the answer, and he had failed at all of it. And he knew he had failed, and he wrote it down in a hand that got smaller as the entries went on. When word came, he made an entry for that day too. The man was constitutionally incapable of leaving a day blank. He was 38 years old, and he had a resolution he had made at 26 in a damp camp in America, in the flat voice of a man adding a column, and he kept it. He never married. Not in the 17 years he had left. There were still offers. A man of his name and his record, a marshal of the realm in Sweden by the end, was worth a great deal to families with daughters. And he declined them the way you decline soup. His sister Sophie Piper had his letters and his confidence and never once got a different answer out of him. He had said he would belong to no one. It had not been a figure of speech, it had been an inventory. What he did have, he packed. The correspondence came north with him in the boxes. The letters in her hand, the fair copies in Sandstrom's, the leather-bound register with its columns of dates and initials, the whole apparatus of a man who could not bear for a thing to have happened and leave no trace. It went into a house in Sweden with a lime avenue and a frozen shore, and it sat there, and he was the only living person who could read a word of it. That is the arrangement he had made with himself, and it held for years. And then one day, it stopped holding. Picture the desk, since nobody wrote it down. A room at Steninga with the light gone by 4. A stack of papers gone soft at the folds from being handled by one man for a decade. The cipher grid, worn. An inkstand, a pen. A candle set where a man with steady hands sets it, which is anywhere he likes. He read them again. He had read them before. And then he did the thing that took 200 years and a machine to undo. He dipped the pen, and he began to black out his own letters, line by line. Understand what he did not do. He did not burn them. The fire was there. Sweden in winter has nothing but fire. And he had every reason, and it would have taken 20 minutes. And he was a man who had run a courier network across a country that opened everything it caught. And he knew precisely what a packet like that was worth to the wrong hands. He kept them. He kept every sheet. Nor did he black out the dangerous parts, which is what any sane man would have done. The politics stayed legible. The money stayed legible. The names of courts, the arguments about Vienna, the plans that had come to nothing, the reproaches, the arithmetic of 2 years of failure, all of it left standing, in the open, for anyone who came after. Stroke after stroke of ink went down on the paper, and what went under the ink was the tenderness. Only that. The lines where she said what she was. He drowned the love and kept the rest. There is no note explaining it, no confession to Sophie, nothing. The act has to carry itself. But consider what he had watched them do to her for 20 years. The woodcuts, the verses, the cellar presses off the Rue Saint-Honoré that could make her a monster by Thursday for a few sous. The whole vast machinery of a country that had invented every possible filth about a woman and never once got near the true thing. They had printed her as a glutton and a spy and a Messalina. They had never had a single real line. If those pages went into the world with her tenderness intact, the pamphleteers would finally be right, and they would be right in her own handwriting. So he took the one thing that had only ever been theirs, and he put it under ink. Not to destroy it. He was not a destroyer. He was a keeper, a man with a register. He was doing what he had done at Bondi, stepping down into the dark so the thing could go on without him. And this time, nobody ordered him to. The pen scratched. The wax in the candle went wet and made that small tearing sound. He worked through the stack the way he had worked through everything in his life, in order, without hurrying. And when he had finished a sheet, he set it aside and squared the edge. There was a mark on one of them that he did not make. Somewhere in the fair copies, years before, at a table with a candle set to the left of a shaking right hand, Otto Sandstrom had put down a lowercase letter, and the tremor had dragged the descender, and he had gone back over it. One hesitating stroke, doubled, a clerk's small correction of a hand that would not do as it was told. It sat there under everything else. When the scientists came, 230 years later, they took it for an erasure. It took them a while to work out that it was only a Swedish copyist with cold fingers, and that the man had been dead since before anyone alive had been born. The letters went into the house, and the house had heirs, and heirs have opinions. They came down through the Swedish family for generations. In the 1870s, a descendant of the Fersens published them, a proper edition, French text, a preface, the whole apparatus of 19th century scholarship. And the blacked lines were printed as blacked lines, because there was nothing else to print. Everyone who read that book for the next 150 years read a correspondence with holes in it. Scholars fought over the holes. There was a school that said the ink was hiding a state secret, and a school that said it was hiding nothing much, and a school that said the letters were forgeries entirely. And every one of them was arguing about a black rectangle. The paper knew. Nobody asked the paper. Then, in 2021, in a laboratory in Paris, some people put the sheets under an X-ray beam and asked. It works because ink is not a color, it is a chemistry. The ink of the writing and the ink of the blacking were made in different pots in different rooms, and they carried different metals in different proportions, a little more copper in one, a little more iron in the other. And a machine that does not care what a word means can be made to care very much about copper. So they mapped the sheets element by element and subtracted one ink from the other, and the buried lines came up out of the dark on a screen, one letter at a time, after 230 years. Gloved hands, a cold room, a queen's cipher, in a language nobody in that room spoke to each other in, coming back up through a wall of black. What was under it was this, that she loved him madly, that she loved him to distraction, that he was not for one moment to doubt that she was entirely his. 15 letters, and under the ink of every one of them, the same woman saying the same thing in a code that took her 3 hours a page to write, from a room where a guardsman had orders not to look away, and the hand that put it under the ink was his own. That is what the chemistry said, in the end, as near as chemistry can say such a thing. The blacking ink was of a piece with the ink in his own papers, and the hand that chose which lines to drown chose only the ones that could hurt her. And the researchers came to the reading that has stood since, that the man who buried the warmest words a Queen of France ever wrote was the officer she wrote them to. Not a stranger, not a censor, not an heir with a family name to keep clean. Him, at a desk in the cold, protecting her from the only people who had never yet had anything true to sell. If you have got this far with these two, subscribe. This channel goes on telling the ones that were kept quiet on purpose. He did not have long. On the 20th of June, 1810, in a street in Stockholm, a crowd that believed a rumor about a dead prince pulled Axel von Fersen out of his carriage and killed him with their hands, and the soldiers stood and watched. He was 54. It was the 20th of June, 19 years to the night since he sat on the box of a hackney cab outside the Tuileries in a drab coat with his collar up, with the reins in his gloved hands, and did not once turn round to look at the woman behind him. He was buried at Steninge. The letters stayed in the house. They are in a case now, flat, under glass. In the light they give paper that has been through enough. You can see the black bars where the pen went over and over, 12, 15 strokes to a line, the ink still sitting proud of the page where it pooled. Under them, in a code that two people worked out between themselves and nobody else ever cracked, the words are still there. They were always still there. Two people who were never once alone together in their lives, in a room with the door shut and no one watching, on a single sheet of paper.